If you think you're unlucky, listen to this story. On the gentle slopes of a quiet hill overlooking a small and bustling village lived Ollie, a man whose silver hair gleamed under the morning sun and whose cane clicked softly against the cobblestones of his narrow path. Ollie's cottage was small but sturdy, a place he had called home for decades. The wooden walls, aged by time, creaked in rhythm with the wind that carried the scent of blooming flowers and freshly tilled soil. The villagers spoke of Ollie often, though not always kindly. Unlucky Ollie, they called him. They whispered stories of his misfortunes, the loss of his wife in a winter storm, the decline of his once thriving trade, and an accident years ago that left him with a limp. To many, he was the embodiment of bad luck, a man touched by misfortune who walked among them with a serene and puzzling calm. Despite the murmurs, Ollie remained unbothered. Every morning he rose with the dawn, brewed his herbal tea, and tended to his modest garden. The flowers in his care bloomed vibrantly, defying the notion that he was a man shrouded in misfortune. Yet the villagers rarely noticed these small triumphs, focusing instead on the more dramatic tales of his losses. Ollie's life wasn't lonely, but it was quiet. He had no children to visit him and few friends to call on. Occasionally, a young boy from the village, curious and bold, would stop by to ask questions about the stars or the herbs Ollie grew. The old man answered with patience and a glint of humor in his eye. These visits were brief, though, as the boy would soon be called back to the bustling life of the village. The whispers about Ollie grew louder each time he descended into the heart of the village. The marketplace, alive with the shouts of merchants and the chatter of neighbors, often fell silent for a moment when Ollie appeared. His cane tapped steadily against the stone, a metronome to his unhurried steps. Eyes followed him, and children, catching the wary gazes of their parents, learned to associate his presence with a kind of eerie inevitability. Yet Ollie never seemed to notice, or perhaps he simply chose not to. He moved through the marketplace with a quiet dignity, pausing to inspect a basket of apples or a bundle of carrots. He exchanged polite words with the shopkeepers, who responded curtly, unsure of how to treat a man they both pitied and feared. As he returned home one evening, the sun casting long shadows across the path, Ollie paused to gaze at the village below. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the distant hum of laughter reached his ears. A small smile played on his lips, as though he could see something that the villagers could not, a truth hidden beneath the surface of their judgments. Ollie whispered softly to himself, his voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. They see bad luck, but luck is just a story they haven't finished reading. The village square was alive with celebration. Bright banners fluttered in the spring breeze, and tables groaned under the weight of freshly baked bread, ripe fruits, and roasted meats. It was the season of the harvest festival, a time for laughter, music, and gratitude. Villagers in vibrant attire danced around a bonfire, their faces aglow with joy and camaraderie. Children darted between the adults, their giggles echoing through the square. As the festivities reached their peak, Ollie descended from his hilltop cottage, his cane tapping rhythmically on the cobblestone path. He wore his usual outfit, a patched vest, sturdy trousers, and a well-worn hat, and carried a small pouch filled with coins, just enough to purchase his weekly necessities. His presence was like a ripple in still water. One by one, heads turned and conversations paused. "There he is," a merchant muttered under his breath, his tone tinged with unease. "Ollie, the unlucky." "Keep your distance," whispered another. "You don't want his bad fortune rubbing off on you." Ollie, oblivious or indifferent to their murmurs, made his way to the grocer's stall. The young man running the stand, Tom, greeted him hesitantly, his smile faltering as Ollie inspected the produce. "Good morning, Ollie," Tom said, his voice careful. "What'll it be today?" "A few apples and a loaf of bread." Ollie replied with his usual calm, placing his coins on the counter. His fingers were weathered, calloused from years of toil, but his movements were deliberate, almost graceful. Tom hurriedly packed the items and handed them over, eager to move Ollie along. Nearby, a group of villagers watched the interaction. Among them was James, the village blacksmith, a robust man with a booming laugh and a reputation for speaking his mind. "Why do you even bother selling to him, Tom?" James called out, his voice carrying across the square. "The man's cursed. Whatever he touches turns sour." Ollie turned slightly, his grey eyes meeting James's bold gaze. There was no anger in his expression, only a quiet curiosity. "You think I'm cursed, James?" he asked, his voice steady but soft, like the first drops of rain before a storm. James laughed again, though it lacked its usual warmth. "It's not just me, old man. Everyone knows. You've lost everything, your wealth, your wife, your health. If that's not bad luck, I don't know what is." The villagers fell silent, their eyes darting between the two men. Ollie considered James's words for a moment before responding. "Perhaps I have lost much," he said, "but have you ever wondered if those losses might be blessings in disguise?" The crowd murmured uneasily, unsure of how to interpret his words. James scoffed, shaking his head. "Blessings? Losing everything? You've got a strange way of seeing the world, Ollie." Ollie didn't reply immediately. Instead, he offered a small smile and tipped his hat. "Perhaps the world looks different from the hill," he said, turning to leave. "Or perhaps it just takes time to see the full picture." As he walked away, the villagers resumed their chatter, but the mood was subdued. James, though defiant, couldn't shake the feeling that Ollie's words carried a weight he didn't yet understand. High above, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, Ollie's figure disappeared into the distance, leaving behind a square filled with questions and unspoken truths. The days following the harvest festival brought a sudden change to the village. The warm, clear skies of spring gave way to ominous clouds that rolled in like an invading army. The villagers, accustomed to the mildness of the season, were unprepared for what came next. It began with a sharp, howling wind that bent trees and scattered loose objects across the square. By evening, the rain arrived, cold, relentless, and unyielding. The village's dirt roads turned to thick mud, and the once cheerful bonfire pits were now pools of water. The skies remained dark for 3 days and nights, with no sign of reprieve. On the 4th night, disaster struck. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the village in brief, blinding flashes. One bolt found its mark on the central grain barn, the lifeblood of the village's sustenance. Flames erupted, fierce and hungry, devouring the dry wood of the structure. Alarmed cries rang out as villagers scrambled to contain the blaze. Buckets of water were passed from hand to hand, but the fire raged with a ferocity that defied their efforts. Ollie, watching from his hill, saw the chaos unfold. The glow of the fire reflected in his eyes as he stood silently by his window, his cane resting against the sill. He sighed deeply, the weight of the moment pressing against his chest. With slow, measured steps, he descended toward the village. By the time Ollie arrived, the barn had been reduced to a smoldering skeleton, its contents lost. The villagers were gathered in the square, their faces streaked with soot and their voices heavy with despair. Crops had been damaged by the rain, and now, with the grain destroyed, the village faced a harsh and uncertain future. "It's him!" a voice called out, cutting through the crowd. Heads turned toward Ollie as he approached, leaning on his cane. "Ollie the Unlucky," the voice continued, trembling with anger. "Ever since he came to the festival, everything has gone wrong." The murmurs grew louder, and soon accusations filled the air. "The storm, the fire, it's his curse," one woman cried. "Why does he stay here, bringing misfortune upon us?" Ollie stopped in the center of the square, his posture straight despite the tension in the air. His eyes swept over the crowd, seeing not just anger but fear. Fear of the unknown, of their precarious future. Finally he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Blame is a comforting thing," he said. "It gives you someone to hold responsible when the world feels out of control. But tell me, do you truly believe I summoned the storm? That my presence called the lightning?" The crowd hesitated, their anger faltering in the face of his question. James, the blacksmith, stepped forward, his jaw tight. "Maybe you didn't cause it," he said, "but bad things happen wherever you go. That's no coincidence." Ollie tilted his head, his expression thoughtful. "And yet, James, has it occurred to you that storms come and go regardless of who stands beneath them? Perhaps what matters is not the storm, but how we rebuild once it passes." The villagers exchanged uncertain glances, their emotions swirling like the storm clouds above. Ollie turned, his cane clicking against the stones as he began the slow climb back to his home. Behind him the villagers whispered, their anger giving way to unease. In his cottage that night, Ollie sat by the fire, watching the flames dance. The village had reached a breaking point, but he knew that within every storm lay an opportunity to find clarity, if only they were willing to see it. The storm passed, leaving the village battered but intact. The skies cleared, revealing a sun that felt distant, as though hesitant to warm the damp earth below. The villagers began the arduous task of assessing the damage, their spirits weighed down by the enormity of what lay ahead. Ollie, from his hilltop, observed their efforts. He saw the fear lingering in their movements, and the way they avoided his gaze whenever he ventured into the village. Alone in his cottage that evening, Ollie sat by his window, his thoughts drifting to the past. His fingers traced the carved head of his cane, a piece of wood that had once been part of a grand oak tree, a tree he had planted with his wife decades ago. That tree had withstood storms, droughts, and time itself, but eventually it had fallen, just as everything did. Yet even in its fall, it had given him something, a sturdy cane that now supported him in his old age. Ollie's memories were not all filled with loss. He recalled the laughter that once echoed in these walls, the warmth of shared meals, and the pride he felt in his thriving trade as a carpenter. But life had a way of balancing joy with sorrow. The accident that left him with a limp had ended his work, just as illness had taken his beloved wife. The villagers saw these events as a series of unfortunate turns, but to Ollie, they were chapters of a larger story, a story still unfolding. That night, Ollie dreamed of his wife, her face lit by a smile that seemed to hold the answers to every question. She stood beneath the oak tree, her hands cupped around a small bird that chirped softly. "You can't cage the wind," she said, her voice as gentle as the breeze, "but you can learn to dance with it." Ollie awoke with her words echoing in his mind, a riddle and a truth all at once. The next morning, as the sun rose over the hill, Ollie made his way to the village. He found the blacksmith James standing by the ruins of the grain barn, his strong hands gripping a hammer as though it could will the barn back into existence. James barely acknowledged Ollie's approach, his frustration etched in every line of his face. "Do you need help?" Ollie asked, his tone unassuming. James let out a bitter laugh. "What help could you offer, old man? Your luck would probably bring the roof down again." Ollie smiled faintly. "Perhaps, but even the unluckiest hands can hold a hammer." He placed his cane against the wall and reached for a nearby plank, his movements slow but steady. Surprised, James watched as Ollie began to measure the wood with a practiced eye, his years as a carpenter evident in every deliberate motion. "I've built more barns than I can count," Ollie said, his voice carrying the weight of years. "If there's one thing I've learned, it's that even when the roof falls, the foundation often remains. You just have to start again, piece by piece." James hesitated, then handed Ollie a nail. Together, they began to work, their silence punctuated by the steady rhythm of the hammer. As other villagers passed by, they paused, their curiosity piqued by the sight of the old man lending his hands to rebuild what had been lost. By nightfall, a small but sturdy frame had begun to take shape where the barn once stood. Though the work was far from finished, a sense of possibility hung in the air. As Ollie leaned on his cane, his body weary but his spirit light, James looked at him with something that resembled respect. "You're full of surprises," James said, his voice softer than before. Ollie chuckled. "The world is full of them too, if you're patient enough to see them unfold." That night, the village felt a little less broken, though few understood why. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of rebuilding began to reshape the village. The new barn, though far from complete, stood as a testament to resilience. Slowly, the villagers began to work together, inspired by the unlikeliest of figures, Ollie. Though his movements were slower than most, his expertise and calm demeanor drew even the most skeptical of onlookers. One day, as Ollie rested under the shade of a willow near the square, a young man approached. Nathan, the village shepherd, was known for his restless energy and quick temper. He had struggled in the aftermath of the storm, his flock scattered, and his small home partially destroyed. The weight of these losses hung heavy on his shoulders. "Mr. Ollie," Nathan began, his voice hesitant, "can I ask you something?" Ollie looked up, his eyes kind but sharp, as if they could see straight into the young man's heart. "Of course, Nathan. What troubles you?" Nathan hesitated, his hands fidgeting with the brim of his straw hat. "Everyone says you've had a hard life, more loss than most can bear, yet you don't seem angry, you don't seem broken. How?" Ollie chuckled softly, the sound like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "It's true, Nathan, I've lost much, but perhaps that's why I've gained what truly matters. Sit, and I'll tell you a story." Nathan settled on the grass, his curiosity overcoming his unease. Ollie leaned on his cane and began to speak, his voice steady and warm, like an old melody. "When I was your age, I thought I had everything. A growing business, a beautiful wife, and a future so bright it blinded me to everything else. Then, one by one, those things slipped away. My trade faltered after an injury. My wife, Clara, passed during a harsh winter, and I was left with this cane and an empty house. At first I was angry, at the world, at myself, even at Clara for leaving me." Nathan listened intently, his usual fidgeting stilled. "But anger," Ollie continued, "is like carrying hot coals in your hands, hoping to throw them at someone else. It only burns you. Over time, I began to see that each loss, painful as it was, taught me something. My injury taught me humility. Losing Clara taught me the depth of love's impact, even when it ends. And the solitude taught me to listen, to the wind, to the earth, and to my own heart." Nathan frowned. "But isn't it unfair to lose so much and gain so little?" Ollie smiled. "Fairness is a curious thing, Nathan. We judge it with eyes that see only a fragment of the whole. What seems like misfortune today may be the very thing that saves you tomorrow. I've learned not to judge the story before it's finished." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the square in hues of gold and purple, Nathan sat in thoughtful silence. Ollie's words lingered like the scent of rain on dry soil, unsettling yet strangely comforting. The next morning, Nathan joined Ollie in his work at the barn. Soon after, others followed, women bringing food, men offering tools, even children carrying small planks. The village, once fragmented by fear and loss, began to knit itself back together. Ollie, though still regarded with caution by some, became a quiet cornerstone of the community's efforts. He never demanded attention or credit, but worked tirelessly alongside them. His presence, once seen as a harbinger of bad luck, now brought a sense of calm and purpose. As the barn neared completion, a transformation began to ripple through the village, not in grand gestures, but in quiet, powerful ways. The villagers, once divided by blame and fear, now worked side by side, their shared labor weaving bonds stronger than the wooden beams they raised. Laughter returned to the square, children's games echoed in the fields, and meals were shared around long tables at day's end. At the heart of this renewal stood Ollie. Though his limp slowed him and his cane was a constant companion, he worked with the precision of someone who had rebuilt not just structures, but entire lives. His hands, calloused and worn, guided others in tasks they hadn't known they could accomplish. His voice, steady and unassuming, offered advice that seemed to unlock solutions no one else had considered. One afternoon, as the villagers rested under the shade of an old oak tree, James, the blacksmith, turned to Ollie. "You know," he began, his voice tinged with a mixture of humor and reverence, "I used to think you were the unluckiest man alive. Now I'm not so sure." Ollie chuckled, the lines around his eyes crinkling with amusement. "Luck is a strange thing, James. It's like the wind, impossible to hold and often misunderstood. We think it favors some and curses others, but it's simply the way life moves. The trick is learning to move with it." James scratched his head, his usual bravado softened. "But how do you stay so calm? After everything you've been through?" Ollie paused, his gaze drifting to the horizon where the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and gold. "I've learned that every storm, no matter how fierce, leaves the ground softer and ready for new seeds. The losses I've faced were not the end of my story, but the beginning of a new one. The hardest lesson was realizing that what we call bad luck often paves the way for something better, if we're patient enough to see it." The villagers fell silent, reflecting on his words. They thought of the barn, now sturdy and nearly finished, and how its destruction had brought them together. They thought of the storm that had stripped their fields, forcing them to replant with care and intention. Slowly, they began to see their trials not as curses, but as catalysts for growth. Nathan, the young shepherd, broke the silence. "You're saying the storm wasn't bad luck?" "Not entirely," Ollie replied with a smile. "It was a challenge, certainly. But without it, would we be sitting here together? Would this barn stand stronger than before? Sometimes the things we dread the most are the very things we need to grow." As the weeks passed, the barn was completed and the fields began to show signs of life again. The villagers worked with a renewed sense of purpose, their laughter mingling with the songs of birds returning to the valley. Even the old rumors about Ollie seemed to fade, replaced by quiet respect and a touch of awe. One evening, as the stars blinked into view, a small group of villagers climbed the hill to Ollie's cottage. They brought baskets of food, bundles of firewood, and warm smiles. When Ollie opened the door, he was met with a sight that momentarily stole his breath. "Thank you, Ollie," James said, stepping forward, "for everything. For reminding us that storms don't last forever and that rebuilding is always possible." Ollie's eyes glistened, though he quickly blinked away the tears. "It wasn't just me," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "You found the strength within yourselves. All I did was remind you it was there." That night, the villagers sat with Ollie under the stars, sharing stories and laughter. For the first time in years, Ollie felt truly connected, not just to the villagers, but to a larger tapestry of life, where every thread of loss and gain wove into a story far greater than any single person. As the seasons changed, the village thrived. The fields, once devastated by the storm, yielded a rich harvest. The barn, rebuilt stronger than before, stood as a symbol of resilience. Relationships, too, had deepened, transforming the community from a loose collection of individuals into a tightly knit tapestry. And at the center of it all was Ollie. No longer unlucky Ollie, but simply the wise old man on the hill. One crisp autumn morning, Ollie descended into the village, his cane tapping rhythmically against the cobblestones. He was greeted warmly, with nods and smiles from people who once avoided his gaze. Children ran up to him, eager to hear his stories, and adults paused their work to exchange kind words. Ollie, as always, responded with a serene smile and a gentle nod, his presence a quiet balm to those around him. That evening, the villagers gathered in the square to celebrate the year's blessings. A bonfire crackled at the center, its light dancing across faces both young and old. James, the blacksmith, raised a mug of cider and called for everyone's attention. "We've come a long way," James began, his voice steady and heartfelt. "And there's one person who taught us to see beyond the storms, to find strength in the hardest times. Ollie, this is for you." The crowd erupted in applause as James handed Ollie a carved wooden plaque. Inscribed on it were the words, "To Ollie, who showed us how to rebuild not just barns, but lives." Ollie, visibly moved, accepted the plaque with trembling hands. He looked around at the faces illuminated by the firelight, faces that now carried hope instead of fear. Clearing his throat, he spoke, his voice steady and warm. "Thank you," he began. "But remember, it wasn't me who rebuilt this village. It was all of you. You faced the storm, the losses, and the hard work of starting over. What I shared were lessons I learned through my own trials, lessons I was once too stubborn to see." He paused, glancing at the plaque in his hands. "You called me unlucky once, and perhaps I was. But luck, whether good or bad, isn't the end of the story. It's just a chapter. What matters is how we respond to it. Every loss teaches us something, and every challenge holds the seed of something greater. The trick is not to judge the story until it's finished." The villagers listened in rapt silence, Ollie's words resonating deeply. For many, his wisdom had shifted their perspective, helping them see their own struggles in a new light. As the night wore on, the festivities continued. Music filled the air, and people danced under the stars. Ollie, seated near the fire, watched with quiet satisfaction. His cane rested against his knee, and his heart felt light. For the first time in years, he was surrounded not by whispers of pity or fear, but by laughter, gratitude, and genuine connection. Before he left for his hilltop home that night, Nathan approached him, his face glowing with determination. "Ollie," he said, "you've taught us so much. But what's the next lesson? What do we do now?" Ollie smiled, his silver hair catching the flicker of the firelight. "The next lesson is yours to discover, Nathan. Keep walking, keep learning, and never stop seeing each loss as a chance to grow. The story isn't over. It never is." With those words, Ollie turned and began his journey back up the hill. The villagers watched him go, their hearts full of gratitude. From his hilltop cottage, Ollie gazed down at the village, now a picture of warmth and unity. He whispered softly to himself, his voice carried away by the wind. "Perhaps the greatest luck of all is learning to dance with the storms." And so, Ollie's story became part of the village's lore, told and retold as a reminder that even the darkest times can lead to the brightest blessings.